Hi class, this is the last section for chapter 8 on the nervous system. We're now going to look at the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. I already looked at the CNS, so let's take a minute now. This is a really good time to review the organization of the nervous system. Remember, there's two major divisions, the CNS and PNS. We've now looked at the CNS in a little more detail. So now we're going to focus on the PNS, and this is a little bit more complicated as far as the organization goes, whereas the CNS is more complicated as far as the anatomy and physiology goes. So within the peripheral nervous system, we have two pathways. We have the afferent, or sensory, and the efferent, or motor. Remember, as we talked about before, afferent means going towards, efferent means going away from. So within the sensory, or the afferent system, we have, this is the sensory side of things. Those are either somatic sensory or visceral sensory. Remember, visceral means the organs inside your body. So these are, this is sensations, or this is sensory information coming from your internal organs, versus somatic, which is everything kind of on the outside. The skin, skeletal muscles, joints, tendons, etc., etc. Eyes, ears, nose, stuff like that. So our nervous system is constantly picking up this sensory information from the environment or from monitoring our internal system, sending that through the afferent nerves, and then those are going to go to the spinal cord and then into the brain, and then the brain's going to integrate and figure out what's going on with all this information. Then going to send out signals to the efferent nerves, and those are either going to go also to the somatic, which is in the outside, same sort of stuff, skeletal muscles mostly in this case, so we call these motor nerves. These are things that we voluntarily control, or it's going to go to the autonomic side of things, which is the internal organs again. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, all of our involuntary movements and things like that, or things that are happening internally that are involuntary. That's the autonomic system. The autonomic system is split into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, the fight or fight, and the rest and digest. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Now, it is within the peripheral nervous system that we find nerves and ganglia. Nerves, which are bundles of axons outside of the CNS. When we're looking at a nerve, there are connective tissue coverings on the nerves. And we're going to look at these different layers, and you're hopefully going to recognize some things. We have the endoneurium, the perineurium, and the epineurium. So endo, para, epi. Where have we seen that before? We saw that in the skeletal muscle, in the muscular system. Endo, meaning the inside, so each individual neuron is surrounded by endoneurium, and then those individual axons or individual neurons are bundled together in fascicles. We also saw this in muscles as well. So the organization here is very similar to what we see in muscles. So the individual neurons surrounded by endoneurium packaged into fascicles, the fascicles are surrounded by perineurium, and then the fascicles are bundled together and surrounded by epineurium. Let me show you, we got a picture here somewhere. Here we go. So here's a picture, you can see this from your book. So here's a single neuron covered in myelin, and you can see, or it's telling us that it's surrounded by endoneurium. And then within that we have these fascicles, bundles of neurons that are all bundled together. This is a single fascicle. You can see all the fascicles within this nerve, and those fascicles are bundles of neurons, and they're surrounded by perineurium. And then the fascicles within this nerve itself, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 6 or 7 fascicles. And the fascicles are surrounded by epineurium. You can see the blood vessels running through this nerve as well. And so that is the way that these nerves are organized within the PNS. So now we're going to be looking at the different nerves within the body. First of all, there are two types. There are cranial nerves and there are spinal nerves. And they're named their names come from where they originate from. So cranial nerves come right off of the brain. Spinal nerves come off of the spinal cord. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and you can see here, so we split them up into sensory nerves, motor nerves, or if they're a mixture of both. They're kind of divided in that way. When we talk about the spinal nerves, all of the spinal nerves have both sensory and motor. All of the spinal nerves have both sensory and motor neurons in the same nerve. But when we're talking about cranial nerves, some only have one or the other. So for example, cranial nerve number 1, 2, and 8 are sensory nerves only. The motor nerves 3, 4, looks like 6, 11, and 12 are motor nerves only, meaning that they're only taking information from the brain to make things run. And then we do have some mixed ones as well, basically everything else. So most of these cranial nerves are dealing with things around our face and our neck. So controlling our eyes, for example, our nose, our ears, our tongue, our mouth, all of these muscles in our head, all of the sensory organs in our head. Most of that's what that is dealing with. However, there is one interesting exception. That's the vagus nerve, and you may have heard of this. This is a large cranial nerve, and it goes all the way down into the internal organs. This major nerve tract that goes down into the internal part of our body, clear from our head. Now, for the purpose of this class, you do not necessarily have to memorize all 12 cranial nerves and the type of cranial nerve that they are. However, this is something you're going to need to memorize at some point, so you might as well just memorize it right now. And what I mean by that is the name and the order. So the order is important. These are numbered. These cranial nerves are numbered, and they're always going to have the same number. They're always doing the same thing. So you need to know these cranial nerves and what type of nerve they are, whether they're sensory motor or they're both. So I encourage you to, easiest way is just to write these down. Practice writing them down, saying them, seeing what they are. Some of them make sense as far as the name tells you what they do. So for example, the olfactory, obviously this is your sense of smell, so that's the very first nerve. So it comes off the brain, comes right up to the nose, and it's taking, but I guess realize that it's taking sensory information the other way. Second one is the optic nerve. This is also sensory, so it comes off of the eyes, goes straight back to the occipital area. Okay, so that's the optic nerve. Oculomotor. So oculo, again thinking of eyes, and then motor means movement. So this one is moving the muscles of the eye. Trochlear is also eye muscles. Trigeminal. Trigeminal has a few different things. It's a mixed one, so it has both sensory and motor. Sensory, it's taking information from our mouth, and for the motor, it's moving our jaws. Abducens is a motor one for our eyes. So there's lots of different nerves that are affecting our eye muscles. Facial nerve, so facial, okay, that may be dealing with our face. So the sensory side of it is the tongue, and the motor part of it is the muscles and the glands and things in our face. Vestibulocochlear, so this one's has cochlear, which is your ear. So, and then vestibulo, so this one's dealing with our balance and our hearing and our inner ear. Glossopharyngeal, so this one, pharyngeal, that probably has to do with swallowing and things like that, right? So sensory, it's your tongue in your throat. Motor, salivary gland, throat muscles, things like that, swallowing, etc. The vagus nerve, this is the one we talked about before. Notice all the things it does. Sensory, many things in our ears, but then it goes all the way down to our ears. Let's see, our ears, our throat, our heart, our lungs, our abdominal organs, and the medulla oblongata. So all of these things are, this one nerve is servicing all these different areas. And as far as the motor part goes, the medulla, throat and larynx, heart, lungs, abdominal organs, all of those are controlled by the vagus. Spinal accessory is a motor one for the medulla, so sorry, coming from the medulla, muscles of the throat, neck, and shoulder. And then finally the hypoglossal, this is a tongue muscle. It's been known for quite some, let's see, sorry, not sure where I was going with that. This is a tongue muscle. So, How do you memorize all these? So if you go online, there's a lot of different videos and things you can watch, and what they do is they come up with little phrases that you can use to learn all of these cranial nerves. So I want to give you an example of one. Okay, so here we go. On occasion, our trusty truck acts funny. Very good vehicle anyhow. That's an example. So if you look at this little phrase here, what you'll find is that the first letter of every cranial nerve is associated with the number. So clear ocean, sorry, on occasion, so on olfactory, occasion, optic, our oculomotor, etc., etc. You can kind of see how that goes. So if you memorize this little phrase, then you can remember these different nerves in order. There's some others as well. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Now the one I just said, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. That is for the function, the type of nerve that it is. So let me write that down here too. So some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. So if you match this up, so some means sensory, say, sensory, marry, motor, etc., etc. So if you memorize the first one, you can write down all 12 cranial nerves, and then memorize the second one, and then write down their type right next to it, and you got it done. Another one, so instead of on occasion, you can say, oh, to touch and feel very good velvet, ah. Anyway, there's just lots of silly little ways to remember these. Like I said, you will need to know these at some point. Here's a picture showing where these nerves come off, and this is why they're numbered as they are. So number 1 is at the front of the brain, number 2, 3, and then it just moves back. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. Alright, anyway, you don't need me to number them. So you can see how they go back here in order, and that's where they get their number from. So that's the cranial nerves. Then we have the spinal nerves. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves attached to the spinal cord. And they are given names by where they are found coming off the spine. And as I said before, they're all mixed nerves. So we have the musculocutaneous nerves that are found between C5 and T1. That's cervical vertebrae 5 and thoracic 1. Radial nerves, median nerves, ulnar, phrenic, intercostal, femoral, and sciatic. Sciatic is maybe one that you've heard of. A lot of people have sciatic nerve issues. But you can see what their functions are. You don't need to memorize these for this class, but realize that these are the different groups of the nerves that are being graded by you. Alright, so once again we're back to this this picture here. We've already looked at this, the organization of the nerve. So let's go to this one, which is a picture showing where the nerves come off. Remember that I said that the nerves the spinal cord ends at the first lumbar vertebrae, and you can see that here. So the solid spinal cord, and then here it branches off, and it becomes this kind of horsetail type structure, and that's where it gets its name from. So this whole last area here is not spine, it's not spinal cord. It ends here, and then nerves will run the rest of the way down the spinal cord, and then they leave and go off to wherever they need to be. So 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar, and 5 pairs of sacral nerves. And there you go, and these are going off to different directions, different places. So sensory information is coming in, motor information is going out in each of these nerves here. Okay, reflexes we already talked about. So the last thing we need to talk about here is the division of the autonomic system, the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so remember that this is the autonomic system, so both of these are automatic and involuntary. And what they're doing is they're they're interacting with the organs, but they kind of have a counter act. So one does where one will speed things up, the other will slow down slow things down, etc. So we call that dual intervention to the organs. All of these have two motor neurons. So remember, this is the autonomic motor nervous system. So these are all motor neurons, and they all have two motor neurons in sequence. One called the preganglionic, and the second called the postganglionic. And we'll look at the differences between these two systems, but one of them is in the length of their preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. So the sympathetic system, fight or flight. I'm going to show you, you can read those slides. I'm going to show you in a picture what this looks like. So this is a sympathetic division. Here's the parasympathetic division, and we're comparing the two here. So here's the cell body of each. Now the first neuron in the sympathetic system is short. The first neuron in the preganglionic neuron is long, and then the postganglionic neuron is short. You can see where they connect here in the middle. So you're going to have to go through a synaptic cleft there. Okay. There are some other differences as well. So because there's a connection here, there has to be a neurotransmitter that's going from the first nerve to the second nerve. And that differs between the two. So in the sympathetic system, the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. In the parasympathetic system, it's acetylcholine, which we've seen before. The location of the motor fiber, thoracolumbar spinal nerves, and then the cranial and sacral spinal nerves. So the sympathetic system is coming off the thoracic and mainly the thoracic nerves. The cranium is generally coming off of things farther down, spinal nerves, base and sacral. And the things that they innervate are the same, and their control is the same. So really these two things in the middle here are what set them apart. Okay, this shows where these neurons are going, where they're originating from and where they're going to. So again, these are motor neurons only. You can see that the sympathetic division versus the parasympathetic division, both of them have neurons going to these specific places. So for example, the heart. You have the sympathetic system bringing a neuron to the heart, and a parasympathetic neuron coming to the heart. So where the sympathetic will speed that heart up and cause it kind of race. So let's say you get scared. Your heart starts pounding, starts racing. That's the sympathetic system. Okay. Parasympathetic is calm, relaxed. It's going to slow the heart down. So depending on where that organ is getting the stimulus from, you can help. You can see what it's going to be doing to that. So sympathetic versus parasympathetic in the lungs. Well, sympathetic speeds things up. That's fight or flight. So that's going to cause us to breathe faster. Where the parasympathetic system is going to cause us to breathe slower. Our intestinal organs. So the sympathetic system will speed things up. It'll bounce things up and make it go faster. Let's see, yeah, so you can see how each of these is affected by that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Okay, so then we already looked at this, the differences between the two. And then the last couple things here, the effects of aging. How does aging affect the nervous system? So our brain actually gets smaller as we get older, especially from the cerebral cortex. Too bad. Learning, memory, reasoning, all of that. Neurotransmitter production decreases. Neurological disorders are more likely to occur, such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and disease. And to help maintain good mental health, we have to maintain our cardiovascular system health. We have to do activities, stay mentally alert, avoid depression, got to exercise as well. And then homeostasis. How does this interact with other organ systems? Detects, interprets, and responds to changes in the internal and external environment. Works with the endocrine system. We're going to be talking about the endocrine system soon, where the nervous system is, so nervous system and endocrine system are both signaling or information pathways in our brain. Nervous system is very, very fast and uses chemicals. The endocrine system is very slow because it's using hormones and they're being sent out into the blood and then traveling around the world, around the body. So there's some differences there. Okay, and I think that is just about it for this course, for this chapter in this course, and we'll see you next time.